I recently came across the story of Betty. She's a mid-aged woman with childhood trauma and adult ADHD, and this is her story. Betty has the feeling that life's a mess. She feels like she can't function as well as other people could. In her daily life, she deals with social anxiety regularly. She's afraid of what people might think of her, and it doesn't matter who it is, the bus driver, the cashier, her partner, anyone. And that makes her spending more time in her head than in reality. Socially, she's a very unconscious talker. She's interruptive and impulsive while speaking. Betty seems to be unaware of her environment, and when you see her waiting for the bus, you can observe that she's nervously bouncing her legs and moving her feet. She regularly misses the bus, and being late to appointments is her normality. Feeling tension and anxious is her average state. She also doesn't just forget appointments, but also to go for food shopping, where she puts her phone, or that she has to make the dishes. She could ask her partner for help, of course, but she feels guilty doing that and then dissociates anytime just thinking about it. Betty appears to be impulsive when it comes to spending money or using her credit card. She likes buying and reading books, but anytime she wants to sit down to read, she couldn't focus her attention on the book more than just a couple minutes. Her days are marked by mood-dependent behaviors. In her head, she thinks, I will make the dishes when I have more energy, or I will stop smoking when I feel ready, but never actually does it. In order to get anything done, she has to push herself really hard and often, if at all, just finish things last minute if the pressure was high enough. So procrastination is her second name. Being in that state, she always is on edge. It wouldn't take much to crush her emotionally. She feels thin-skinned and permeable. No boundaries, no sense of protection, just extreme sensitivity. So Betty easily gets triggered to intense emotionally dysregulated states of shame, resentment, or grief. She therefore spends a lot of time in states of dissociation or isolation. From the outside, she somehow seems off or inattentive, but from the inside, she feels depressed but not enough connected with herself to notice that state of mind. To endure all the stress, she drinks a lot of coffee in the morning, smokes weed and cigarettes during the day, and drinks wine in the evening because it makes her calm down. On the level of her thoughts, she's constantly ruminating when she would get it all together. Her mind constantly asks, when will I be finally able to function like all the other normal people? And what the hell is wrong with me? Well, if you now can identify yourself with the story of Betty, you may now have an answer. You could be someone with childhood trauma and adult ADHD. And to help you gain clarity on that topic, today I will present to you 7 clear signs that you have both of these conditions. I also want to explore how a traumatic childhood can activate ADHD in adults, and in the end, I want to discuss solutions and treatments for people who are affected. If you think you may have CPTSD and ADHD, definitely stay with me today because this one can be truly helpful for you. Let's dive in. Welcome to this episode. My name is Robert, and before we start, this video is the third one of a 3-part series on childhood trauma and ADHD. The first episode was all about identifying symptoms of complex trauma. In the last episode, we talked about the ADHD side of things, and today we talk about signs that you have both conditions. All the other episodes below today's episode and in the description. Also, I want to mention that this video today is based on the article PTSD and ADHD on neurodivergentinsights.com by the psychologist Dr. Megan Neff and the work of the healthcare professional Patrick Tian. I am not a therapist myself. I just do the research, try to bring things together with my experiences from therapy. Let's go on the same page with definitions at first and define both conditions here really quick. What is ADHD? ADHD is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. It's a neurodevelopmental disorder that affects roughly 5% of adults worldwide. Other sources even name 6 to 7%. Usually, ADHD is already diagnosed in children. It also runs in families, so there is a genetic link. There is an 80% chance to get ADHD if your parents already have it. So usually, it's an innate neurodivergence. That means that you're born with it. Major characteristics of ADHD, as we talked about in the last episodes, for example, symptoms are inattention, so difficulty regulating your attention, impulsivity, and hyperactivity. When diagnosing ADHD, there are 3 potential classifications or forms we talk about. There is ADHD-I, which is characterized by the difficulties in regulating your attention. There is ADHD-H, which is characterized by impulsive and hyperactive behavior. And there is ADHD-C, which is characterized by both inattention and hyperactivity, impulsivity. CPTSD stands for Complex Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder. It's also used often similar to what we call childhood trauma or childhood post-traumatic stress disorder. And CPTSD is basically a traumatic reaction of a prolonged or accumulated series of small unfavorable events, as I said, often during childhood. Those people with CPTSD have been living in an abusive household or facing chronic neglect as children, and studies estimate that 13 to 30% of people experience some form of CPTSD-related symptoms as adults, so a major part of our population. Typical characteristics for CPTSD are basically somatic symptoms and reactions, such as hypervigilance, that you're always on high alert, chronic pain, and emotional flashbacks. Unlike ADHD, which you're born with, CPTSD is shaped by the experiences you go through, often when you're young and vulnerable. Let's directly dive into sign number 1, that it's CPTSD and ADHD. And sign number 1 is that you grew up with undiagnosed ADHD. Growing up with undiagnosed ADHD is a huge cause for the development of childhood trauma, because when ADHD goes undiagnosed in childhood, you grow up thinking that your struggles are just who you are, or that you are somehow flawed because of your ADHD. You just don't know better as a child. Maybe you look back as an adult and then you understand all that, but as a child, you have absolutely no clue when you have undiagnosed ADHD and everyone is telling you that you're somehow weird, wrong, can't sit still, always move, can't concentrate, have worse grades than others. Well, from peers, teachers, and partners, you therefore might hear all of these things. Why can't you just sit still like everyone else? Or your grades are bad, but you're not stupid, so it's just that you can't focus enough. And you think, well, that's so weird because I try hard, but it just not work for me. But anyway, these messages will stick with you and will layer shame and self-doubt on top of your ADHD symptoms that you already try to manage. And this is a lot for a kid, but also a lot for an adult when it will stick with you. While ADHD can make childhood harder, trauma can make your ADHD even worse, especially as an adult. As an adult who experienced a childhood full of undiagnosed ADHD, you will often therefore feel misunderstood, feel like an alien, constantly criticized or told that you were too lazy or not living up to your full potential. Have you heard that before? Then this might be you. You might be still struggle to focus, to finish tasks, or to stay organized. Those things are typical for ADHD and also come hand in hand with complex trauma if you have both conditions. Sign number 2, you dissociate in social situations. Do you ever find yourself zoning out during conversations, completely losing track of what someone just said? or feeling like you're not fully there in a group setting. If you have ADHD and CPTSD, this can happen a lot, and it's not just about being distracted. It's dissociation. Let's say you are scattered and need help with a task, but you're afraid to ask because you feel guilty asking. Then you ask, but become vigilant and then dissociate. So you zoom out, you disconnect your mind and your body, and instead of listening and getting help, you just lose track of time and space. Have you had that in your life? For someone with ADHD, social situations can already be overwhelming. There is so much to focus on: facial expressions, tone of voice, keeping track of the conversation, and your brain might struggle to keep up with all of that. But with ADHD and CPTSD, it goes even deeper. For people with childhood trauma, dissociation becomes a survival mechanism. If a situation feels tense or triggers a memory of past trauma, your brain might check out to protect you, leaving you feeling disconnected from the moment. This can also go up to feelings of depersonalization and derealization. And it's not just about daydreaming or losing focus here, which we talked about in the last episode. I'll link to below, of course. It's your mind's way of trying to shield you from perceived emotional threats which come up. And it doesn't matter if there is a true threat or not, because your mind, and especially your body where the trauma is stored, is constantly trying to scan the environment and trying to identify potential threats. And this can feel very frustrating and isolating, but it's important to understand and know this part of your experience and that it comes from your trauma. Sign number 3, you spend more time in your head than in reality. I've read this on YouTube quite often. Actually, it seems that for people with ADHD and CPTSD, it is a common experience that they are stuck in their own thoughts, constantly overthinking everything and missing what's actually happening in front of their eyes. The problem here is that ADHD makes it hard to filter distractions, and CPTSD adds hypervigilance so that your brain is constantly on high alert, and it's trying to juggle everything at once, and that's really difficult and overwhelming. And this is where the mess and the chaos we talked about of people who are affected with both conditions actually applies. This behavior especially often shows up in everyday situations, like trying to focus during a conversation but then losing track of what's being said because your mind is spiraling, replaying past mistakes, worrying about doing something wrong, or trying to manage every little detail at once. Your life is constantly just happening within your head when you're in those spirals. And in moments like these, even simple tasks can feel overwhelming, leading to frustration and self-doubt here. What's interesting is that when you manage to get out of your head, whether through music or through engaging in another conversation where you feel comfortable in, or just grounding yourself, for example, through a breathing exercise, then you might notice how much easier things actually feel and that you constantly have been in your head and not present in reality. But staying present isn't as easy as it sounds, especially when your brain is constantly wired to overthink and use it as a way to stay safe. Sign number 4, you're highly sensitive to everything and everyone. Do you ever feel like the world gets kind of under your skin? Like you're too open, too exposed, or even permeable to energy, to emotions or sensations around you, so they just can enter you without any boundaries? Then this is the exact reason why everything and everyone triggers you. For people with ADHD and CPTSD, this heightened sensitivity is a constant reality, and it's like having no filter between you and the world around you. With ADHD, sensory sensitivity is also common, so loud noises, bright lights, or even certain textures can feel unbearable. Add CPTSD into that mix, and this sensitivity becomes emotional as well. So you might observe the moods of others around you. You feel drained after social interactions, or you sense tension in a room before anyone else even says a word. It's as if your nervous system is constantly on super high alert, on max volume, interpreting everything as either too much or too intense. My second therapist once explained to me that in trauma, basically this sensitivity and this reaction is basically quite right. So it's definitely a good idea to scan for threats and to check if there is anything potentially dangerous going on. But the volume is too intense. So this reaction of scanning and being sensitive to the world is just maxed out. This thin-skinned feeling can leave you exhausted for sure. And maybe the buzz of a crowded cafe feels already unbearable, or a friend's bad mood feels like it's sinking directly into you. Even small things like the way someone looks at you can feel magnified. It's not just the physical sensations that appear in the body on that level. It's also about the emotional and relational sensations here as well. Because what's tough about when you have these sensations, it will make you withdraw in order to protect yourself from all this overwhelm. So you might avoid certain environments or people just to avoid this overstimulation. And I made a video already about that matter, why we isolate and avoid other people. I will link that to you up here in the description below. This behavior also reinforces that sense of fragility, leaving you stuck in a cycle of constantly feeling exposed and retreating further. If you struggle especially with that symptom of feeling highly sensitive to everything and everyone, learning to set healthy boundaries can be a crucial solution for you. For me personally, it definitely was and still is. And because of that, I created a new course on how to set healthy boundaries. And into that course, I packed all the things I learned, especially from my second therapy, which was norms therapy, where I explored how I can work with my body, how I can become less permeable, set those boundaries, and stop feeling constantly highly sensitive to everything and everyone. So in this course, you can also learn to keep out these high levels of energy and don't absorb everything. I released the course and other courses in our premium community, which is also a safe place for highly sensitive people, for neurodivergent people, people with childhood trauma. And if you want to join our community, just go to understandable.net/join, get access to the community and all the courses, understandable.net/join. And now let's talk about sign number 5, that it's CPTSD and ADHD. Emotional dysregulation is your second name. Now, emotional dysregulation is definitely a huge trauma symptom, and I will make another video about that beginning in 2025. And I will also release another premium course about emotional dysregulation on our platform as well. For people with ADHD and CPTSD, this symptom can definitely feel like a constant battle because it's so intense, it completely fills you up and it really disrupts your daily life. Because whenever someone who has those conditions is triggered, he or she will experience this sensation. And emotional dysregulation is not just feeling deeply, okay? It's struggling to manage the intensity of those feelings. You just can't stop dysregulation because it's a neurological mechanism. I explain the mechanism of emotional dysregulation in this episode about dysregulation. With ADHD, emotions can hit hard and fast. A small inconvenience can spiral into frustration, or a kind word can bring overwhelming joy. That's typical for the ADHD side, at least when ADHD is alone. When you just have this side of ADHD, emotional outbursts go away as fast as they come. But when you add CPTSD to that mix, those emotions are often tied to survival instincts. Triggers, even subtle ones, therefore can send you into a fight, flight, or freeze mode, making it impossible for you to stay calm. You might experience this as quick mood swings or feeling like your emotions take you over before you even realize what's happening. For example, a small argument with a friend might leave you spiraling in anger or shame for hours. Or a tiny mistake at work, for example, might feel like the end of the world, even though you know logically it's not a big deal. Is that you? Well, the rational brain is not working properly here. When you have that in your life, then people around you might describe you as overreacting or that you're too sensitive. But the truth is that is not actually a choice of you. It's about how your brain processes these emotions based on what the brain has learned during childhood in order to survive. A recent study revealed that it's actually happening within your brain on a neurological level. So it's not a mindset problem here. So when you deep dive into neuroscience here, that study shows a dimmed and reduced activity on the left side of the brain and the flared up and increased activity on the right side during emotional dysregulation. Sign number 6, you use drugs and substances to regulate stress. Why do people with trauma and ADHD use and abuse drugs and substances often? The answer is simple. Because these things distract them from unbearable emotions and are just regulators for a chronically dysregulated nervous system, which is so typical for ADHD and CPTSD and that combination. Examples for that are you might rely on caffeine to push you through the exhaustion of ADHD brain fog, or use alcohol to quiet the emotional chaos of CPTSD at the end of the day. Sounds familiar? This is happening to so many people who are affected with those conditions. One thing we all know for sure still is that first, this behavior is definitely not healthy, and second, these coping mechanisms might work temporarily, but over time, they often create more problems than they solve, reinforcing a cycle of dependency and shame here. Many people who drink or smoke weed in order to keep themselves regulated don't like to talk about these things because it fills them with a sensation of shame. The truth is, consuming those substances in order to stay regulated, it's not about a weakness at all here. It's about a survival mechanism. Addiction is a super common thing in people with PTSD. Many people with childhood trauma and other traumatic experiences, they turn to substances because they haven't found another healthier way to manage their stress and energy levels. So I want to remind you that you shouldn't judge anyone who's consuming substances or is addicted to alcohol, to other drugs. No, it's a coping mechanism. It's a tool they use in order to manage stress and to keep themselves regulated. It's better to offer them help and show empathy, compassion, understanding if you do that yourself, or if you know someone or see, for example, your partner, a close friend, a family member abusing substances to keep themselves regulated. Still, substances, and that's very important to mention, don't address the underlying causes, as we said. They don't help you with the stress on the long term, and they don't help you to resolve the cause for emotional dysregulation. That's also true. Okay, so recognizing these patterns first is the very first and most important step here towards breaking the addiction to substances, to alcohol, to drugs. It's very important if you want to break free from this substance abuse behavior that you find alternative tools like exercising, for example, like grounding techniques or even therapy, which can help you to regulate your emotions better and to address the cause of this dysregulation. I want to empower you by saying that you definitely deserve relief and you deserve to find healthy ways to cope with your trauma or your ADHD symptoms. And I also like to add that if you are currently struggling with substance or drug addiction, or you have someone in your close circle who is struggling with that, please look for professional help, for a professional therapist or support. Think about your health first. And sign number 7, you are trapped in a cycle of shame and guilt. Toxic shame is the first and foremost the most typical indicator for complex childhood trauma. And I already made a full episode about toxic shame, which I will link to you up here in the description below. But of course, if you have both conditions, toxic shame definitely appears a lot. ADHD will therefore catalyze the sensation of shame and guilt. And that's because with ADHD, forgetfulness, impulsivity, or struggling to focus are also added to that toxic mix. And those things can then lead to feelings of failure, especially when these traits are misunderstood by others. With CPTSD, those moments of failure can trigger memories of past criticism, rejection, or neglect. So it's not about just the mistakes in the present then, but it also becomes tied to deep, lingering feelings of unworthiness. An example for that is, let's say you miss an important deadline at work and immediately spiral into guilt, thinking, why can't I just get it together? I'm always messing things up. Or maybe you get overwhelmed during a social interaction, leaving you feeling ashamed of how you handle it and questioning your worth then. So you tie that situation to your self-worth. In these examples, your ADHD symptoms are triggering your trauma and vice versa. And this shame often leads to avoidance, so avoiding those tasks, avoiding people, or avoiding situations that trigger even more guilt. This is also definitely a source of isolation or the need to isolate and avoid other people. But the more you avoid, the more the shame will build, reinforcing the belief that you're incapable or broken. So always avoiding and isolating is definitely not a solution here, because it gives you a painful loop that is incredibly hard to break then, a vicious cycle of toxic shame and guilt. Again, in the episode about toxic shame, which I will link to you down below, I already talked about how to break that cycle. But what you have to understand when you're actually in that cycle right now, the cycle of toxic shame and guilt is not your fault, and ADHD and CPTSD both affect how your brain processes mistakes and self-worth. So keep that in mind and look at that toxic shame cycle with compassion. Now, after hearing all of these signs, let's have a final look at the Venn diagram once again. So we talked about the left side here, CPTSD side, about attachment problems, hypervigilance, emotional flashbacks, toxic shame and guilt, avoidance and isolation, and physical symptoms. We talked about those things especially in the first part, in the first episode of that series. In the second episode, we talked about the ADHD side, about hyperactivity, impulsivity, self-criticism around ADHD behaviors, about inattention, forgetfulness, and boredom, about hyperfocus, distraction, and interest-based motivation, and task completion and time management problems. And today, we see that there is definitely an overlap when both conditions are present. Dissociation, so that you zone out, that you disconnect yourself, your mind, and your body. This is definitely a huge thing which appears when you have both conditions. Emotional dysregulation, one of the biggest symptoms of complex trauma, but definitely also present and catalyzed when ADHD is also present. High sensitivity, when you're highly sensitive to everything and everyone. Boundaries are very important here. A tendency for substance abuse. Addiction is a typical thing, a typical symptom of CPTSD, which also appears in ADHD. Don't judge people who have this symptom. And when ADHD is undiagnosed, especially during childhood, then trauma is also catalyzed and you will see, a higher chance that trauma will appear. Trauma and ADHD definitely can activate or trigger one another. And I also wanted to, have a look into the science and the data behind that. And what I found is that, first of all, there is a high prevalence rate of trauma and ADHD with around 10%. And it definitely makes sense because undiagnosed ADHD in childhood definitely causes childhood trauma. And we discussed that in sign number 1. And that is because children feel like aliens. When ADHD is undiagnosed, they have no clue what is wrong with them. They feel that they don't fit in. They feel that they are somehow different, and especially in our current school system, education system, they just fall into that gap. They just constantly get mirrored that they're somehow wrong and flawed, that they can't keep up with other children. Psychology also brings up another term here, which I read, which is complex ADHD, which I think is a good fit for that. But science now also shows that complex trauma can also activate ADHD in people who are genetically predispositioned. And this is even more interesting. Now, I found this article here, and it says, once traumatized, a person may eventually meet the criteria for ADHD, even though ADHD was not present in the early development. And this is because PTSD, so post-traumatic stress disorder, rewires and affects development of a growing brain, stunting the growth of areas that deal with emotional regulation, impulse control, and self-awareness. ADHD is a neurodevelopmental condition that often runs in families, yes, but when someone with ADHD experiences early trauma, it then activates or intensifies the symptoms, as we just heard. Okay, so trauma changes the brain in significant, often similar ways as ADHD, as we saw in the last episode. And what is important to understand here is that trauma doesn't cause ADHD. Instead, it amplifies what's already there, making the symptoms feel more overwhelming. For example, chronic stress from a chaotic home environment or early neglect can push ADHD traits like hyperactivity or difficulty focusing to the forefront. This overlap between trauma and ADHD can make it hard to untangle where one ends and the other begins, and this is why so many healthcare professionals have difficulties distinguishing between those two conditions. But now, what can you do if you're affected with one or both conditions? Let's talk about solutions and treatments right now. First of all, if you suspect to have ADHD, trauma, or both, start by consulting a mental health professional. I know it's really hard to even find a psychiatrist who can do a diagnosis, but I think it's definitely worth to put you at least on a waiting list. ADHD and CPTSD often overlap, and a professional psychiatrist who can diagnose you can definitely help you to understand what's going on and guide you toward the right treatment plan. So if you already think that you might have one of these conditions, but you're not actually sure, or even both of them, getting a clear diagnosis is a very important step here. Don't just rely on self-diagnosing here, because getting clarity from a professional and getting empowered from them as well can definitely improve your quality of life. I also have to say that getting an official diagnosis for complex trauma, that's really rare, and most psychologists and psychiatrists don't actually do that. But when you talk with a psychologist or psychiatrist, they will definitely give you hints or let you know that you have or might have such a thing as complex trauma. For ADHD, it's a bit different, because there you probably will get an official diagnosis, but many people want to have a clear diagnosis for that, so the waiting lists are long here. Still, I would try it. Point number 2, seek the right therapy, because getting a clear diagnosis will help you to look for the right therapist, to find someone who's actually specialized in ADHD and or complex trauma. Working with a specialist for trauma and or for ADHD, that can truly improve your quality of life. For complex trauma, somatic therapy is a really good thing. I had experiences with that as well, with my second therapist. And for ADHD, a therapy approach where you learn to manage the symptoms is also pretty helpful. People in our community said that cognitive behavioral therapy is not a good idea for people with ADHD, and it kind of makes sense because CBT actually works on a behavioral, quite of superficial level, and for people with ADHD, same for people with autism, for example, it's really difficult to try to change behaviors or things which are a result of their neurodevelopmental condition. So CBT probably not a good idea, but trying and learning to manage and working with the symptoms and accepting them, that's another pair of shoes here. That's probably something that truly helps. Number 3, medication is a tool and not a fix. So for ADHD, stimulant or non-stimulant medications can definitely be life-changing. They can help you to focus, to regulate your emotions, and to feel more in control. But the downside of medication, of course, is that you can get addicted to them, as we talked about in the science before. Well, for trauma, there are also some medications. They can reduce anxiety or depression symptoms. But for just CPTSD symptoms, from my experience, medications are the most effective when you combine them with therapy. Remember, medication is a tool, not a cure, especially for complex trauma. So it's about finding the right balance here for you. And number 4, finding a supportive community. And a supportive community and environment can be a big catalyst for your healing journey. And this is why I created our community here for understandable members. And our community is a safe place for people with CPTSD, with ADHD and other neurodevelopmental conditions. And as I explained to you earlier, we also offer guiding online courses that show you a step-by-step path on how to resolve especially the symptoms of complex trauma, on how to communicate your emotions, your needs, and set healthy boundaries so that you don't feel that exposed and permanently anymore. We have all the resources you need to regulate your nervous system and hopefully to experience a safe place for your condition. And you can access the full community and the platform as a member. Just go to understandable.net/join and become a member today. And now I'm curious, what do you think about the whole series? Or do you have ADHD and or CPTSD? Definitely leave me a comment below today's episode. If you want to support the podcast, share the episode with someone that you think that might have those conditions. Rate 5 stars on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. And I see and speak to you next Sunday for another episode here on the channel. Have a great day.